first podcast on histology. Today we're going to talk about the 4 different types of tissue and focus in on epithelial tissue. On this picture right here, you have the 4 tissues starting in the top left corner being nervous tissue, then you have connective tissue, muscle tissue, and epithelial tissue. And epithelial tissue is our focus today. Epithelial tissues are tissues that line the body surfaces. They have a basement membrane and what we call as an apical surface, so you can see where there is an ending to the tissue. They are important because they they have some special characteristics. Things like cellularity. You have a lot of cells in a dense space. They have specialized contacts where they have these gap joints that hold them together so they can make these strong bonds with one another and have these tight spaces between their cells. They support our connective tissue through our basement membrane. So you have your epithelial tissue on the top and then you have your connective tissue below. They're avascular, which means that the nutrients can diffuse through them really easily. And then they have a ton of regeneration qualities. Because they form the outside and lining of these surfaces, they have to be able to reproduce rapidly to keep up with the demand. And they have a high capacity for being innervated, which means that they have nerves that run through them. Some general functions of epithelial tissue depend on the type of epithelial tissue, but mainly they are the covering and the lining of organs, including your skin, things like the outside of your lungs, all of your internal organs. When they slide up against each other, the reason that it doesn't hurt constantly with all of that friction is because your epithelial tissue is there to secrete some mucus and to allow those organs to slide past each other one after another. In addition to covering and lining the body, they form most of our glands, your endocrine glands and your exocrine glands. They also create absorption and secretion and filtration of all of these hormones and fluids that move through them. And then they form those slippery body surfaces like we said before. Epithelial tissue is classified according to 2 different things. You have your simple epithelial tissues, which are single layers of tissue. You'll see on the apical surface, in the picture over here, the apical surface is towards the top. There will actually be a space with the apical surface, and then the basal surface is towards the bottom. And if there's a single layer of tissue, this is what we call a simple epithelial tissue. When you start to look at tissues that have multiple layers going down, those are our stratified epithelial tissues. And then we have their shapes. A flat shape that kind of looks hexagonal is what we call a squamous epithelial tissue. If they have a cube shape, then they're cuboidal epithelial tissues. And if they form long columns, then we call them columnar epithelial tissues. This is a description of your simple squamous epithelial tissue. This is actually the alveoli in your lungs. You have nuclei that are around the outside of the cell, and each of those jagged linings make up the cell. This is a simple squamous epithelial tissue because we have a single layer of tissue. Notice that they're disc shaped, and these allow for filtration and diffusion. If you know anything about the lungs, when you breathe in, that oxygen and carbon dioxide have to diffuse past each other. So having these simple squamous cells on the outside allow for that material to pass easily, and there is a need for energy. It's also found in your kidneys, the lining of the heart, blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, ventral cavities, all sorts of places. But the important thing is that simple squamous epithelial tissue allow for diffusion very quickly, and that they look like these flattened cells. Next up, we have simple cuboidal. Notice there the outlining of these glands. You have the basement membrane towards the outside, and then on the inside there's a space. And the shape that lines that space is what we're looking at, and those are the simple cuboidal epithelial cells. These happen to be in the kidneys. They are for secretion and absorption. They're absorbing nutrients. They're secreting what they don't need. You find them in the kidneys, in some of your small glands, and on the surface of the ovary. Next up is our simple columnar epithelium. Notice the cells are much, much taller than what we looked at with the cuboidal cells. Sometimes they have cilia, which are these little extensions that are on the end of the cell or on the top towards the apical surface. Most of the time, their nuclei will line up nice and orderly, so it's easy to tell that they're simple columnar. And sometimes they have something called a goblet cell, and what a goblet cell does is it secretes a gland or a mucus, or a gland or a mucus, a hormone or a mucus into whatever organ they're a part of as a means of helping in absorption and secretion. They do have different functions depending on where they are. If they're in the respiratory tract and they have cilia, they're meant to kind of move things throughout the bronchi so they don't get stuck and caught into your lungs. If they're found in the digestive tract, their main goal is to secrete those juices and those enzymes to help break down the food into the necessary components that we need. This is what we call pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. I know it's a mouthful. What you notice are a couple of things about this. They are a single layer of cells, but they're at differing heights. So if you look at the top, the nuclei don't line up all nicely the way that they did in the columnar epithelium. They can contain goblet cells just like the columnar epithelium, the simple columnar epithelium. But if you notice, those goblet cells, they have that mucus lining in them, and then there's cilia on the outside of this one. So this happens to be of the human trachea, which is the breathing tube that goes down your throat. And the ciliary action is what keeps those cells, that disease, from staying in your system. You also find this kind of ciliated columnar epithelium in the tubes that the sperm come through in, and that's because we want those sperm to keep moving forward. So pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. Whew. Epithelial tissues, we have multiple layers that build upon one another because they undergo a lot of wear and tear. On the right, you have a stratified squamous epithelial tissue. On the left, you have another form of stratified squamous epithelial tissue. And then in the center is a stratified cuboidal epithelial tissue. Again, stratified epithelial tissues go through a lot of wear and tear, so they need to have a lot of layers to add that extra protection. This is a picture of a stratified squamous epithelial tissue. You'll notice that the layers are those flattened cells. They kind of look almost eyeball shaped in this particular picture. And they're that thick membrane. There's not a single layer here. It's obvious that there are multiple layers of that stratified squamous epithelium. The apical surface is towards the top, and then there's a basement membrane, and you have your connective tissue that lies below. And that's generally what happens in your stratified squamous, in your stratified epithelial tissues. There are differences between having keratinized and non-keratinized epithelial tissue, and that's because the keratin allows, like your skin, to be waterproof, and it keeps that liquid from absorbing into your skin. It has an important function. Next up, we have transitional epithelium, and this resembles both stratified and simple cuboidal because there are differing layers of cells. You have the nuclei falling at different places, and that's what makes this transitional. It is a form of stratified because it's not a single layer of cells. Again, you have the connective tissue basement, just like the stratified squamous epithelium. And this particular type of epithelial tissue is what you find in organs that stretch. Things like your bladder, the uterus, the ureters, which feed down into that tube. They stretch out, and they need to have that ability to kind of move and grow. And that's the function of transitional epithelium. Glandular epithelium. Now, we have two different types of glands. We have our endocrine glands and our exocrine glands. Endo means inside, so those particular glands release their hormones to the inside of the body. And exocrine glands release their secretions to the outside of the body. These are things like your sweat glands. In the glandular tissue, you have the single layer that circle on the right-hand side, and those are our endocrine glands. And then if you look at the one on the left, that would be an example of an exocrine gland. Remember, they secrete things like mucus from your nose. Yes, it's lovely. I have a cold now too. They also secrete your sweat and your salivary glands, you know, when you have some good food, and that tingle comes from the back. It's those cells releasing those enzymes into your mouth, so you get that saliva buildup in your mouth, preparing you for digestion. You also have, when you're breastfeeding, mammary glands secrete that milk into those ducts with the response of the children latching on. So they have a specific function, and that is to release some sort of fluid into the system. That's it for me today, and I hope you enjoyed epithelial tissue.